Now, turning to our program, I'm pleased to welcome John Rouser, President and owner of the Rouser Agency, a 50-year member of Rotary, to introduce our speaker. John, come on up.
There's that 50-year thing again. You were nice enough a couple of weeks ago in the People of Action flyer to dote on me a little bit for that accomplishment. But if you're trying to give me a hint, if you're trying to phase me out, it ain't going to work. I'm going to be around as long as Charlie, if not longer. And I have a new hero. I don't know if any of you saw Rita Moreno in 1961 starring in West Side Story. She starred in the remake just 2 years ago, dancing and singing. She's 92. So, again, I'm not going anywhere. I'm going to keep this very short. Chris Ecos, my friend and colleague, is going to speak about the history of healthcare, and I know that he's going to dip into the Q&A. So bear with us, please. It's worth it. And Chris is not going anywhere after the program, so if you do have questions, he'd be happy to hang around for a while. Chris is a senior executive with one of the leading health insurers and administrators in the country. He has over 30 years in this experience, in this business, Greenhorn. That's a joke. He's experienced much of the history of health insurance. He's a certified employee benefit specialist, has been in local leadership roles with various industry organizations during his career. Having grown up in Ohio, he's lived in the Milwaukee area for the past 45 years. Chris believes that while America has the best health care in the world, our delivery and payment system is flawed because it is an accident of history due to the decisions of those in power for over a century. Chris?
Thank you, John, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you to Rotary Club of Milwaukee for inviting me out here today to share my thoughts on the history of health insurance in America. Many feel that this may be at the top of the agenda of the various political parties as we approach the 2024 election. And it made me wonder, how did we get here? Why do we have a system that's unlike any other in the world today? One that's often described, as John mentioned, as an accident of history because it wasn't designed to finance healthcare like any other country. Rather, it's derived from the decisions and the actions of the federal government, employers, labor unions, insurance companies, providers, and we, the consumers. We're the constituents that have created the intended, but more often the unintended consequences that have left us with the options that we have today. And why should we care? Because as we look forward for the solutions, it's important to understand the positions of those in power over the last century and realize how their decisions are impacting their priorities today. So I ask you to imagine, what do you think was the most dangerous place you could be on Earth at the turn into the 19th century? Are you thinking the jungle wilds of Africa? Maybe it's paddling deep up into the Amazon? We'd be wrong, because it was here, in a hospital in America. Hospitals were factories of death. There was no notion of what we have today in terms of medicine. A nurse would wash an entire ward with the same water. You could have your wounds treated twice a day with the same sponge, and there was a term at that time called that good old hospital stink, literally. And that term was referring to the dead and the dying bodies that were accumulated in a hospital. No, you weren't in a hospital at this time unless you were desperate, poor, mentally ill, or blind. If you had any resources, you had your care either at home or at the home of your physician. And it was this way throughout much of the 1800s until a French scientist named Louis Pasteur and a brilliant English surgeon named Joseph Lister and others discovered that microorganisms were the cause of disease. And it was at this point that medicine was born as a science. And the impact was felt immediately in the form of pasteurization, immunization, sanitation, and sterilization in the hospitals, in the operating rooms, as well as their utensils. So by the end of the 1800s, it's all about the change for these hospitals as people began to feel that they were going to get the comfort and care at these facilities. In 1872, there are 147 hospitals in the United States. In 1972, there are 7,000. But how would you pay for all this care? Well, if you're thinking insurance, you go back to 1850 for the first type of health insurance policy of any kind was the Franklin Insurance Company of Massachusetts had a steamboat and rail accident policy. There were a lot of steamboat and rail accidents, and these policies were so popular that within 20 years there were 66 companies that were doing this type of insurance. But they soon they were very overextended, and many either failed or consolidated into companies with names that we recognize today: Travelers, Aetna, Prudential. By 1890, progressives are looking for the federal government to provide sickness insurance for loss of income due to illness in the way that the voluntary mutual aid societies were doing in Europe. But the federal government wanted no part of that. Some employers and even some banks did provide that coverage. By 1900, the insurance companies are starting to offer employers group life and disability policies, but not health. There's also a movement at that time from workers to have their employers provide loss of income due to accidents. That started in the rail industry. And in 1910, Wisconsin, the first state where workers' compensation is offered, providing that coverage in the event of an accident at an employer. But you can see this connection between employers and the employee and some type of insurance coverage. How many of you remember this famous image of federal policymakers in Washington, D.C. getting together and creating our employer-sponsored health insurance program system? Yeah. No one will remember it. That never happened. This is an accident of history. Federal policymakers have had a century to come up with a federally structured program and have repeatedly rejected it. In fact, in 1912, Teddy Roosevelt, in his run for president, in his progressive or Bull Moose party, had national health care as part of his platform, which of course he needed after he got shot here in Milwaukee as part of his campaign. But he was not reelected in 1912, or elected in 1912. So the American Association of Labor Legislation is widely credited with coming up with the first government-sponsored healthcare template in 1915, which would offer 26 weeks of hospitalization for maternity care and physician coverage, $50 for burial, paid for by 4% of the worker's wages, contributed equally by the worker, their employer, and the state government. Between 1915 and 1920, that proposal was put forth 16 times in various states. None passed. The 1920s were the roaring 20s in this country, but they weren't for hospitals. Hospitals were struggling. They have high fixed costs due to their labor costs, as well as they're very expensive to operate, and those costs aren't dependent on how many people are in their facilities. The solution came for hospitals in 1929 at the start of the Great Depression, when 1,300 school teachers agreed to pay 50 cents a month, $6 a year, for 21 days of hospitalization coverage to the Baylor University Medical Center in Dallas, Texas. It was an amazing success. Within months, there were thousands of people on this plan, and the idea is spreading around the country. In the communities in the Northeast, the hospitals got together and said, let's offer our patients a choice. In Sacramento in 1932, the hospitals put together a program, and they called it Blue Cross. In 1933, in Minneapolis, the Blue Cross of Minnesota starts using the early Blue Cross symbol. In 1935, there are 15 Blue Cross plans in 11 states. That same year, the Social Security Act in 1935 was passed with Democrat Franklin Roosevelt's Committee on Economic Security was charged with putting together a program to provide assistance for those in financial distress due to age, disability, and illness. That committee actually had national health care on their agenda, but it never made it out of committee because it would have doubled the payroll tax. In 1938, there are 38 Blue Cross plans in the country with about 1.5 million people in them. In 1945, there are 19 million people in 80 Blue Cross plans, and that represented over 60% of the market. But it wasn't like other insurance. Insurance to that point, covered you, indemnified you from a catastrophic loss, and it had a high deductible. These plans covered service fees. They had no deductible, and they were started by hospitals, not insurance companies. Most people didn't care. Even in 1929, 21 days was a very long hospital stay. And the cost for being in the hospital were the same, whether you were in for a hernia or a heart attack. And these only covered the hospitals. Doctors were not in these programs, and it did not want to be. So they only covered the hospital bill. So the patient didn't have a big financial outlay. So they didn't really shop around. And somebody else was paying for it anyway. So they really liked this coverage. Hospitals loved it because they had a patient that didn't understand what anything cost, so they tended to utilize more services. More services meant more cash flow. And without any competition, they didn't have to keep their prices in check. I mean, really, the only thing that would have been any better for the hospitals at this time would have been if there was a favorable regulatory environment and tax treatment. Well, commissioners of insurance wanted to regulate these plans, but the American Hospital, American Medical Association said, wait a minute, these are not for profit. These are community-based. They take anyone who applies. They don't have salespeople, and they community rate their premiums. These are charitable organizations. The IRS agreed. They were exempt from federal taxes. So now with this favorable regulatory environment in most states and favorable tax treatment, these Blue Cross and now Blue Shield, the physician component, which started in 1939, as I said, they thrived. They had over 60% of the market. The private insurers had to come out with their own cost-plus service arrangements in order to just be able to compete. And with all this insurance now floating around, the hospitals really didn't have much incentive to reduce costs or be efficient. So by 1940, there are only about 9% of the population are in a workplace-based insurance plan. But that's all about to change with the start of World War II, with rationing, price controls, and a wage freeze. And with that, the National Labor Board ruled that fringe benefits did not constitute wages. So at a time of an intense worker shortage in this country, employers are having to expand their benefits in order to retain and recruit employees. At that same time, the federal government determined that employer contributions to health insurance premiums would not be subject to federal income or payroll taxes. And that was later codified in 1954, well after the wage freeze and the war had ended. So the war ends, and millions of soldiers return to feed the American manufacturing machine. And many of these soldiers join labor unions. And the Taft-Hartley Act of 1947 rules that unions can collectively bargain over conditions of employment. The National Labor Relations Board rules that fringe benefit meets that definition or does not constitute wages. The National Labor Relations Board rules that it does not constitute wages. And so the Supreme Court upholds that ruling in 1949. So what we see then are the unions successfully negotiating strike for the expansion of their benefits. Between 1950 and 1965, health compensation as a percent of total benefits more than tripled for union workers. In spite of all that momentum, there's still a push in Congress by some to provide national health care for the poor and the lower working class. But again, does not make it out of committee because of the distortion of the payroll tax. In 1948, Democrat President Truman is running for re-election, and his campaign platform, called the Fair Deal, he has national health care. And when he is surprisingly re-elected in 48, he quickly moves to push Congress to pass his national health care plan, but it is vilified and ridiculed as a socialist plot straight out of the Soviet Union during the height of the Red Scare. It goes nowhere. The Truman administration does pass legislation, though, to provide funding for hospitals to modernize and to have new construction if they agree to provide a reasonable volume of charitable care. That charitable care volume is never defined, nor is it scrutinized, at least not for decades. It's also at this time that the insurance companies come out with their major medical to provide coverage for the catastrophic costs. So as you think about 1950, you think about the charge is set, the fuse is lit, and we're heading towards this explosion in healthcare costs. But the boom everyone hears are these, the baby boomers. 76 million of these are born during this period, and they're going to have a tremendous impact on healthcare costs, but not yet. This charming little guy was born February 11th, 1957, at Mercy Hospital in Tiffin, Ohio. His mother said that it was a normal delivery. It may not have been a normal child, but with that, she was in the hospital for 5 days. 5 days. This registered nurse, wife of a school teacher on a Blue Cross plan, didn't have to pay the bill, but she had the bill. What do you think the cost of 5 days in the hospital was in 1957? That would be too expensive. It was $170 for the 5 days. By the way, does this look familiar to anybody? I didn't have glasses or long hair at that time. As we move into the 1960s, it's a struggle for the aged and the poor for health care. There's a very modest program out in 1960 to provide some assistance for the aged, but it's very feeble. The federal government decides they're going to track national health care as a percent of GDP in a slightly different way in 1960, and it's 5%. That same year, President John Kennedy, Democrat, is elected, and he looks to provide national health care for those on Social Security. But again, it is rejected and opposed because it's social medicine. By 1965, half of all Americans over age 65 do not have any health care. And the Democrat Lyndon Johnson administration passes the Social Security Act of 65, which is Medicaid, national health care for the poor, and Medicare, national health care for the aged. Harry Truman is the honorary first enrollee in Medicare. So why did the associations that had been so opposed now support this program? When you think about the convoluted structure of Medicare and realize that Medicare Part A is for the hospital coverage and Medicare Part B for the physician coverage, you begin to see that it was designed to support those industries. It was also at that time that the usual and customary was designed as a way to theoretically keep prices in check. These physicians and other providers that had been so opposed to social medicine across the country suddenly found millions of new patients flooding into their office, now with insurance. Most of them, their incomes doubled by the end of the decade. And think about the flow of funds on the Medicaid programs. Medicaid money went from the federal government to the state to the providers, meaning that for virtually every hospital in this country, the state government was now their top customer. They had to think about this when they were making their own decisions about how they were going to run their businesses and their clinical support. By the end of the 1970s, Americans are waking up and saying, yeah, it's expensive to provide health coverage for a segment of the population, especially when they're older and they consume a lot of care. National health care's percent of GDP is 6.9%. And there's another outcry for national health care, except this time they have an unexpected ally in Republican President Richard Nixon, who compounds his own party and supports national health care. So in 1971, when Democrat Senator Ted Kennedy proposes a universal coverage, single payer plan that would be funded by additional taxes, Nixon counters that with a program that would preserve private health insurance. It would require employers to provide coverage and have subsidies for those that couldn't afford it. They get together and discuss it. Policymakers debate which one's better. But under intense pressure from the labor unions, Senator Ted Kennedy walks away from the deal. He later says that this was one of the biggest mistakes of his life. Shortly thereafter, a little thing called Watergate is revealed, and it consumes the administration, the country, and national health care once again fails. During the Nixon administration, though, Kennedy does propose a piece of legislation that passes the Health Maintenance Organization Act of 1973, which Nixon also supports because of its goal of the triple aim of better cost, better quality, and better access. That bill limits or takes off the limits and the restrictions for creation of HMOs, but it also required that any employer with at least 25 employees that offered health insurance was mandated to offer a federally qualified HMO option. This was stunning at that time. There are only 3 million people in the United States in 1973 that were in HMOs, and they were isolated in geography and industry, mainly to the West Coast and the public sector. We'll get into HMOs a little bit later, or continue with that a little more. In 1974, under the Republican Ford administration, the Employee Retirement Income Security Act is passed, providing employees protection from their employer with their retirement funds, as well as their funds in self-funded medical plans. In 1977, a group of healthcare professionals in Minneapolis created a company called UnitedHealthcare to manage and operate HMOs. So as we close out the decade of the 70s, there are now 9.1 million people on HMOs. National healthcare expenditures as a percent of GDP are 8.9%, but the Republican Reagan administration is more focused on controlling interest rates and the recession and not healthcare. In 1982, the Blue Cross and Blue Shield associations merged to one association. They had intentionally kept themselves separate until then. Also in 1982, two giants, Connecticut General Insurance Company in North America, merged to form Cigna. 1986, the Consolidated Omnibus Reconciliation Act, COBRA, was passed in the Reagan administration, giving former employees access to their previous employer plans, even if they have pre-existing conditions, as long as they pay the premium and remain on the plan for a limited period of time. In 1987, there are 662 federally qualified HMOs in the United States. There are 25 in Wisconsin, and there are 9 in the Milwaukee area alone. And some of those names you might recognize if you were here at that time. Some were local, some are national. Most don't exist anymore. At the end of the 1980s, there are 36.5 million people on HMOs, and national healthcare expenditures as a percent of GDP are 12.1%. setting the stage for, with the election of Democrat Bill Clinton in 1992, he is going to take on national health care with his Health Security Act of 1993. His plan will preserve private health insurance, have marketplaces for individual coverage at the state, have a mandate employers provide coverage, and have no pre-existing conditions. He has his wife, Hillary Rodham Clinton, be a part unofficially of his cabinet with her role to pass this, get this legislation passed. We're told by the Clintons that this is going to be simplified, compassionate, free from bureaucracy, but when a draft of the bill is leaked in late 1993, with then the full bill released, the language of the bill describes a massive top-down, bureaucratic command and control that would meticulously govern virtually every aspect of the finance and delivery system of our healthcare. This flowchart is released at that time, revealing and illustrating how simple that plan would be to what is now called Hillary Care. The health insurance industry lobby mobilizes to create a series of ads featuring Harry and Louise, a mature couple that have discussions of various points around their house with such anguish and despair on how they would have to live with the burden of this health care. Well, this health care kind of collapses under its own weight. Employers never get behind it. The administration is distracted with foreign affairs and balancing the budget. But two important pieces of legislation are passed during the Clinton administration regarding health care. Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, HIPAA, giving all of us the right to privacy of our records, as well as access to our records, and as well as limiting pre-existing conditions. And the Children's Health Insurance Program, CHIPS, is a program giving children under age 19 access to health care, to Medicaid, if they're children of parents that don't otherwise qualify for Medicaid. And both of those are well in effect here today. But due to this Hillary Care scare of the 90s, there's tremendous disruption in the health insurance industry as many of the large carriers merge, are acquired, create new companies out of nowhere. There's tremendous activity in that industry. In 1994, the Blue Cross Association agrees to allow their plans to convert from not-for-profit to for-profit status so that they can raise capital and make acquisitions and compete. Many of those plans were struggling. It was an interesting dilemma for the states as they had to look for creative ways to recapture that value that these plans had enjoyed of 60 years of not-for-profit status, including right here in Wisconsin with that conversion. In 1995, the federal government rescinded that requirement that you had to have a federally qualified HMO. HMOs did not need any assistance in the 1990s to get more business. In fact, the health insurance carriers were looking to control costs by using the HMO structure to create narrow network plans or plans with gatekeepers to help them control costs. Well, it worked. In 1990, national healthcare expenditures, healthcare costs as a percent of expenditures were 13.3%, the smallest increase over a decade. In the 2000s, Republican George W. Bush is looking to expand Medicare to provide coverage for prescription drug for Medicare recipients. And his Medicare Prescription Drug Improvement and Modernization Act does that with Medicare Part D. Also embedded in this legislation is Medicare Part C, which we know today as Medicare Advantage plans, which are very popular. And in that legislation is the construct for the enabling of creation of health savings accounts, HSA plans, which are also prevalent throughout the employment world today. All three of these in that legislation 20 years ago this year. In 2004, two huge public Blue Cross plans, WellPoint out of California and Anthem in Indiana, merged to form what was then the largest health insurance company in America. They went by WellPoint, then they went for many years by Anthem, and they just changed their name to Elevance last year. In 2006, the state of Massachusetts came out with their state plan, ironically referred to as Romneycare, because the Republican governor of Massachusetts at that time was Mitt Romney, even though he vetoed several of the key provisions of that bill. Those vetoes were overridden by the legislature. That Romneycare was sort of the basis for what the 44th president, Barack Obama, elected in 2008, was looking for when he was going to take on healthcare reform shortly after he was elected. And he has his colleague from the Senate, the senator from Massachusetts, Ted Kennedy, Democrat Ted Kennedy, be his point person on getting this legislation passed. There was a Democrat-controlled House and Senate, but it was a struggle in 2009 until Christmas Eve. The Senate passes a bill, 60 Democrats, 39 Republicans, 99 votes, not 100, because Senator Ted Kennedy had passed away that fall and never voted for the bill. The bill gets passed over to the House, which in March of 2010, without a single Republican vote, passes the Patient Protection Affordability Care Act, Obamacare, or ACA, which the President Obama signs on March 23rd of 2010. This bill is so complicated and the plan is so complicated, it's going to take 3 years to complete the implementation of this. In 2010, national healthcare expenditures as a percent of GDP are 17.4%. The Republicans, in order to counter this Affordable Care Act, looked for a challenge legally to the individual mandate provision, which said that every American must have health insurance or they're subject to a penalty. Republicans challenged that to the courts, elevating it to the Supreme Court, who in 2012 ruled that the penalty was, in fact, a tax, essentially a tax, and therefore they upheld the legality of the Affordable Care Act. That same year, Barack Obama defeats Mitt Romney in his reelection bid, and it's on to the first open enrollment for ACA, Affordable Care Act, in January of 2013, which, as we know, did not go well and was disappointing with 8 million people that enrolled in that program. The Affordable Care Act created some disruption in the healthcare industry. Aetna offers to buy Humana, Anthem offers to buy Cigna. Intense scrutiny and opposition from shareholders and regulators. Both deals eventually collapsed. In 2016, Donald Trump is elected president. Some would say that this is an accident of history, but that's somebody else's presentation. He campaigned on the repeal of the Affordable Care Act. And with a Republican-controlled House and Senate in 2017, the House passes a bill over to the Senate where there's a dramatic vote to repeal the Affordable Care Act that is rejected by a single vote, largely attributed to the late Republican Senator John McCain. President Trump wastes little time, though, using executive action to essentially eviscerate the individual mandate by determining that that penalty will be zero. He also eliminates the subsidies to the health insurance companies. More disruption in the industry as the CVS buys Aetna, Cigna buys Express Scripts, UnitedHealthcare already owned Optum, RX, and Anthem creates their own prescription benefit managers as the insurance companies look to align with their prescription drug dispensaries and create more efficiency, more revenue, and more control. At the end of 2019, the Democrats are positioning for who is going to run against Donald Trump. And many of those candidates, most notably Bernie Sanders, want national health care as Medicare for all, as he did in the prior campaign. But Senator Joe Biden, look, his campaign is to expand on the Affordable Care Act, and he is the eventual nominee. As we move into 2020, we all know what happens there 3 years ago. Everything about anything that we do changes. Federal and state governments declare emergencies. There's waivers for Medicaid expansion. Medicaid goes from 60 million people to 80 million people. The CARES Act provides financial security, stimulus for some people, also guarantees coverage for COVID care. And as we move towards the election later that fall, it is more about pandemic coverage and not about the Affordable Care Act. We know that Joe Biden is eventually elected president. Before he leaves, though, Donald Trump signs the Consolidated Appropriation Act, which has the No Surprise Bill and the Transparency Bill embedded in there. Now, President Biden looks to fulfill his promise to expand Affordable Care Act with the Rescue Plan of 2021, with premium tax credits to increase enrollment in ACA. And then they want to take on the administration, the fixing the family glitch, which is eligibility based off of your individual coverage rather than family coverage, which they eventually do with the Inflation Reduction Act of 2022. Also in that act is an extension of the enrollment period and increasing the thresholds for qualifying for subsidies, as well as giving the government the right to negotiate Medicare. Today, there are probably close to 16 million people, or there is close to 16 million people in the affordable care plans. We have the national health emergency ending next month, where many people will lose their Medicaid coverage. We're estimating that many of these people will end up on the affordable care plans. I think the GOP has pretty much conceded that the Affordable Care Act is here to stay, but there have been many legal challenges to it. There continue to be, and I see our new state Supreme Court judge here today. There are still many legal challenges to the Affordable Care Act, surprisingly, right to this day. None have been successful. So, national health care expenditures as a percent of GDP in 2020 were 19.7%. You know, today we're already over 20%. The disruption that we're seeing in the industry today is more focused around the provider communities, as around this country, mega systems are becoming meggier, bigger, are getting bigger, mediums are becoming large. We've seen it here in our own community last week with the announcement of Freighter merging with ThedaCare up in the Fox Valley, Aurora merging with Advocate, and merging with Atrium. Independent hospitals in this country are rarer and rarer and rarer. So where are we today? Or where are we going? We're headed, I believe, for another collision in this accident of history, regardless of what happens in the 2024 election. Is it going to be a scrape along the guardrail, T-bone at the intersection, or are we driving over the cliff? Is that next thing going to be legislation or coming from the private sector in the form of innovation and disruption? I don't know. But what you people do is really important. You are smart people. You influencer in our community. You influence at your companies. You have influence with your families. We need you to be a part of this collision avoidance system. You got to take control of your own health and look out for others, because if you don't, someone you know, someone you love, maybe already will be part of that collateral damage in this next accident of history. Thank you very much. If you have any questions, let me know, and I'll be around for a little bit after the presentation, if that helps.
Excuse me. Thank you very much. That was very interesting, right here. Should I stand up? I don't know. I'm curious. Do you have any countries that have national health insurance that you can point to that are ideal? Well, I don't know if there's anything that's ideal, but something that perhaps we could have or will be able to model after?
No. I mean, I'm thinking about if I were to create a series, one topic would be our system versus other countries. But as I said, as John said at the beginning, with the flaws of our system, I'm not aware of any country that has a system that isn't flawed as well. And it's just in a different end of that bubble, unfortunately.
Yeah, hi, Bill Lafebe. I'm a retired dermatologist, so I've been through the whole thing, the whole story. When I started practicing in '84, HMOs were hardly anything. My senior partner said, well, Bill, do you think we should join these HMOs? And I said, well, I've got to tell you, I think it's the future. We probably ought to. And we did, and we survived, but that's not my question. My question refers to after World War II, all of Europe became socialized medicine. All those people became, but we did not. And it's a great experiment because when you look at it now, they aren't spending 20% of their GDP on healthcare.
Correct.
And their people are healthier. Now, maybe not the insurance, and maybe because they're more active or whatever, but it's sort of very interesting how that worked out. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, again, I think this is why, or when, as I described the history and the way this, I think, emergence of hospital insurance in 1929 just created a foundation for what the expectation in this country was for coverage, that after World War II, it was so embedded. And then with that expansion of the healthcare by the employers during World War II, with that National War Labor Board and the fringe benefits, it just created and there was also just this cultural distrust, for some reason, of social medicine, that it was socialist and not socially rewarding or fulfilling. And I don't think it's the same thing, but I think most people felt that it was at that time.
You're right. There's no going back at this point, but it's just fascinating how that turned out and
Right.
a great experiment.
Hello.
Hi.
In your presentation, you talked a lot about the interaction between insurance and prescriptions. Something that came to my mind is the idea of naturopathic care and their relationship with health insurance, as it is just now starting to interact. So, can you talk about that?
Natural what care?
Naturopathic medicine.
Oh, naturopathicness. Yeah.
Yes. Someone I know is going to school for that, and she's having issues with insurances. So, can you elaborate on that?
Well, it's I'm not sure how that plays into the history, but it, or maybe it's more of the history of the influence of the pharmaceutical industry in our country. There's so much tied to the studies on the scientific efficacy and the way that they determine, the FDA and others determine what value there are in the pharmacoeconomic value of these drugs, that I think doesn't exist in a lot of that natural medicine realm. But I'm honest, I don't know much about the natural medicine realm. And I know that, but I do know people that have faith in that and feel that it has been the reason why they can live the healthy lifestyles that they live. But I don't know, Antoine, exactly why we are where we are exactly with that.
Thank you.
Hi. For everyone who has health insurance with their employer, that cost is really baked into the whole foundation of their compensation. You know, whether they're union, non-union, it's a piece of that. And it just seems to me that, you know, that's the really hard part of trying to make a conversion to a single payer system, is just unraveling that issue. You know, do you go back and say, well, somebody sometime deferred a 3% raise in their union contract because they got better health insurance, and so now the health insurance goes somewhere else, and so do they get that money back? You know, is there any roadmap for really unraveling and disconnecting those two elements?
I don't see it. I'm sorry to say.
I was thinking the same thing.
Yeah, it's complicated, and it's been embedded, as I said, for almost 100 years now. More. There it is.